Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Harold, for the introduction, and thanks for the organisers for inviting me here today. Listening to what Linda had to say and what Joan had to say really kind of puts into context kind of what I'm going to look at now as a case study. So maybe the ins and outs of cremations that Linda has spoken about, and then maybe the sentiment and the emotions surrounding cremation and burial that Joan discussed, you might like to keep in the forefront of your mind when we look at this particular burial at Hermitage in County Limerick. Now, before I start with any archaeological excavation, it's very much a team effort. So this particular excavation was undertaken on behalf of Limerick County Council in advance of a water scheme. Dr. Linda Lynch undertook the bone analysis for us. Ellen O'Carroll did the wood identification, which will become clearer as I speak. Professor Gabriel Cooney looked at the axes. Professor Woodman looked at the other lithics. Chris Micklejohn gave some advice on cremation burials, Mesolithic cremation burials in general. Amy Little is currently looking at the artefacts that I'm going to show you, and of course my colleagues at Aegis for the excavation and post-excavation of the project. Now, I was pitching this at a more lay audience than archaeologists, but I see that there's quite a few archaeologists in the audience today, so I apologise for being maybe a bit basic. But when exactly is the Mesolithic? You'll probably notice we begin there at about 8,000 BC. To date, we don't have any Paleolithic evidence or very strong Paleolithic evidence for human habitation in Ireland. So this is why most of our timelines begin in the Mesolithic period. And so you can see there, the earliest peoples we have were found at Mount Sandal in County Derry, and they date to about 8,000 BC or 10,000 years ago. And our Mesolithic at the moment is divided up into an earlier and a later period. Now there's a hiatus or a gap in between the early and the later periods, and that has yet to be filled by archaeological evidence. And that gap is between different diagnostic tools. So different tools were used in the early Mesolithic than the later Mesolithic. But as we get more archaeological evidence, those gaps will probably be filled in due course. Now, just to note, again, I apologise to my archaeological colleagues, radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon dating is particularly important in a prehistoric context because it's prehistorical. We don't have any written documents to depend on. And really, radiocarbon dating came into being in the 1950s when it was realised that we could measure decaying C13 and C14. Now, all living creatures absorb carbon during their lives, and then when they die, that carbon intake ceases, and the breakdown of carbon begins. And boffins and scientists can measure this breakdown and give us firstly a BP date or before present date, and then that can be calibrated or adjusted into our calendar date. So that's really radiocarbon dating in a nutshell. And really, for archaeologists, that was really a watershed moment in that we could now really calendar date things going back thousands and thousands of years. Now, what is our evidence of the early Mesolithic in Ireland? So we're talking about that very early period of about 10,000 to 8,000 years ago. And you can see that they're fairly dispersed throughout the country, but with all distribution maps, they can be misleading. And in this case, it may be the fact that Professor Woodman was based in the northern half of the country, whose specialism is the Mesolithic period. And then when he moved to become Professor of Archaeology in UCC, down in the south in Cork, then early Mesolithic materials started to pop up in the southern half of the country. And since this map was produced by Professor Woodman in 2009, there have been other early Mesolithic finds throughout the country. And when these are both habitation rather than burial. So getting on to Hermitage then. Hermitage is a townland just outside Castleconnell, the village of Castleconnell in the northern part of County Limerick. You can see it's situated right beside the River Shannon. And the reason why Sarah McCutcheon, Limerick County archaeologist, was testing in the area was you can see the SMR, the Sites and Monuments, RMP, the Recorded Monuments and Places map, that this is a possible fording point across the Shannon. Now, having given several talks in in Castleconnell and its vicinity, I've been told that you would never cross the Shannon at this particular point. It's not a place where you would cross. But it is a fantastic place for fishing, and it still is. And so maybe when we're looking at this evidence, we might think of it rather as being a fording point across the Shannon. It may have been a good place for fishing, both now and in the prehistoric period. So just to give you an indication of where it is on Google, on the top left-hand corner, you can see that that is the head race rather for Ardnacrusha power station. So it's not a million miles away from the power station. And this, just to show you on the right-hand side, is what archaeological features, those excavated pits that Linda showed you earlier, this is what they look like before they get excavated. So soil differentiation and soil colour changes is what highlights that there's archaeological features in a particular area. And then this is just a schematic of the wayleave for the pipe that went through Hermitage. And the dots there indicate where we found Mesolithic material. Now the first pit, and probably the most important one, was Pit A in Area 8, the red dot there. A small pit. Now, as you saw from Linda's statistics, most of the cremation burials that we find in Ireland date to the Bronze Age. So, of course, when we were excavating these features, we didn't know they were Mesolithic, and we assumed that they would probably be Neolithic or Bronze Age, because that's when there's a preponderance of cremations in Ireland. So we didn't realise the significance of them when we were excavating. So you can see here the pit. It was quite a large pit, but please note the post hole, or the hole that the ranging rod is resting in. Now, when we took all the contents of that pit out and we sieved them, and from the sieving we found these two very small microliths and this much larger axe, which we found when we excavated on site. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Mesolithic has typical tool types, and microliths are one particular typical tool type of the early Mesolithic period. So when we found the microliths and they were confirmed to be such objects, we realised that we were dealing with probably a much earlier and more significant find. Now, this is a reconstruction of what perhaps this pit would have looked like. So the hole that I showed you with the ranging rod, that seems to have been a pit marker. And it's our interpretation that it probably held something like a post above the ground due to just its depth, really. Then the axe was resting against the post, and then the cremation, the bone and the microliths were surrounding the axe. Now, the axe, you might remember from the picture, was burnt also, so it's quite likely that it was burnt within the cremation. And Dr. Amy Little, who's looking at used wear on these artefacts, has confirmed that it probably was burnt at a very high temperature. Now, the radiocarbon dates, to get back to them, we dated both the charcoal that was within the cremation and the bone itself. And you can see that for prehistoric radiocarbon dates, they come very close together. So in prehistoric terms, they're as near as damn it as being the same. So you can see that these BC dates, they're almost 8,000 BC, so they're very early, and they are the earliest burials in Ireland at the moment. Now, the second pit we got was different in shape and morphology to the first one. This one had much less cremated remains in it. It's marked there by the blue dot on the schematic, and it didn't have any indication of any above ground marker. There was no stake holes or post holes in the bottom of the pit, and a much larger pit. Now, the radiocarbon dates from this particular example, after we sieved out the charcoal and the bone, again, in and around 7,000 BC, so later than the pit A, but very early nevertheless. Now, we actually had a third pit, which also returned a radiocarbon date in the early Mesolithic period. Now, this also had cremated bone in it, but unfortunately the bone was so small and of such a small amount that it was impossible to know if it was human or animal. But our charcoal, which was identified by Ellen O'Carroll as alder, did return a Mesolithic date. So this one may or may not be a human cremation pit. So again, my thanks to Linda for doing the analysis on these cremations. And again, her graphs are showing the two pits, pit A and pit B, what was expected and what actually was returned. Now, really, in summation, pit A had over 1,000 grams, I think it was 1,700 grams of human bone, and this suggests that the entire body was cremated and deposited in the pit. Whereas pit B had a very small amount of cremated bone, just over 100 grams. So that either meant the entire body was cremated and only a portion was put in the pit, or only a portion of the body was chosen for cremation and then deposited in the pit. Now, to give some human remains date comparisons, and this map again is Professor Woodman's from 2009, showing the early Mesolithic finds in Ireland. You can see that the earliest dates we have for burial prior to Hermitage date to the later Mesolithic period. But interestingly enough, one is from also from County Limerick near Cappamore, and another is from County Kerry. Now, neither of these examples were cremations. And in fact, in a European context, there are early Mesolithic cremations from Scandinavia and France, but there are not yet any found in, say, Great Britain or Portugal or Spain. Now, kind of broadening out the discussion then of what we can say about Hermitage, and in light of what Joan particularly said earlier, what is the archaeological interpretation of this? What can we say? Well, firstly, you can see there that a cremation it's labour intensive and it takes a long period of time. And also the people who are undertaking the cremation must be skilled in burning a body. You need to maintain high temperatures for a long period of time in order to get the burnt remains like we found in Hermitage. So to quote Linda, if I may, the people who burned these burials at Hermitage, or these bodies at Hermitage, knew what they were doing, and it wasn't the first time that they had done it. And again, you can just see there at the corner, it reminds us that a pyre has to be maintained over time, so it's not something you can just set alight and move away from. And again, in light of what Joan said, unfortunately, the rituals and the celebrations or otherwise that were happening around this leave very little archaeological trace, so we can only suppose what might have happened. Now, what has been found in many cremation cemeteries, for instance, in Scandinavia, is that there's occupation associated with where people are being buried in the Mesolithic period. And at Hermitage, indeed, we did find possible occupation evidence for Mesolithic occupation. Now, in the Mesolithic period, people were hunter-gatherers, and we assume that they were nomadic, although they probably used the same base camps, as they're called, on a seasonal basis. And of course, if we think of Hermitage as being a place good for fishing, it's quite likely that this area was used as a seasonal camp. And this is just an example of possible occupation. What you're looking at in the photograph there is the slot trench of a small hut. And within that hut, we found another stone axe, an adze axe as it's called, and this was kindly identified by Professor Gabriel Cooney. Now, as part of the Blood of the Irish RTE documentary, looking at Ireland's people, they actually reconstructed the hut. So that's just a picture of what this hut may have looked like. So you're looking in the Mesolithic period of this place at Hermitage with burials and people living there on a seasonal basis. Now, in addition to all of that material, there was, because this was really a construction site, a lot of topsoil was removed. There was several field-collected lithics. I mean, there's well over 100, but these items have been identified by Professor Woodman as being early Mesolithic date. The latest one that was found was the one on the top right-hand corner, which was actually found by Francis Lynch, if I remember correctly, during the monitoring of the pipeline. So actually, when the pipe was going into the ground, this was picked up. So there's a broad range of early Mesolithic material coming from Hermitage, which also suggests occupation over time. So bearing in mind what Linda and Joan have said, what are the issues that kind of come up when we're looking at an excavation such as Hermitage? Well, the first one is the skill in cremation. Prior to the find at Hermitage, we didn't know really what the Mesolithic peoples were doing with their dead. Lots of them were disarticulated remains, sometimes found in caves. But we thought, were they being left exposed? Were they being disposed of in a way that wasn't very important, and that some kind of afterlife or ancestral, looking after your ancestors wasn't really important to them? But what Hermitage shows, that at least some individuals, whether they be high status or not, were deemed very important, and a lot of time and effort went into their burial. The next thing then is this space and place. So what was the significance of the place? Well, I was really put in my place when I was told that Hermitage, there was no way this was a fording point. But so the fishing element comes in then. And of course, fishing and fish were very important on a seasonal basis in the prehistoric period. And so that resource was probably exploited. But it also relates to a kind of a pragmatic place like fishing may have had some kind of ritual significance also. In a pre-Christian, I'm not talking about in a Christian ideal, but in a prehistoric kind of a way. And then the significance of time. Was this place only used on a seasonal basis? And if we think about the dates of the burials, you know, they're over a long period of time, over hundreds and hundreds of years. So this place must have borne some importance over that period. Also, the sophistication and formalized ritual that must have gone about in cremating these burials, putting the grave goods, in the case of Pit A, into the pyre so that they could be burned with the body, then gathering up all the material. Due to the small fragment size of the cremation in Pit A, it's suggested that, Linda suggested that it may have been pounded before it was put in the ground. And then depositing of the artefacts also. And then, leading on for the possible occupation activity that we have, was this a Mesolithic community roaming this part of North County Limerick? And this was part of their territory that they returned to time and again. And probably one of the most interesting things that we discovered based on our interpretation is that the burial in Pit A was marked in some fashion. And so the marking meant memory and remembrance, that people may have been returning to this spot, maybe to remember maybe living there with this particular dead person, or remembering this dead person in particular. So the remembrance and memory is something that was never considered for Mesolithic burials to date. So really what Hermitage is after doing, it won't be the earliest burial in Ireland forever, but for the time being it is. But it's opening up ways of looking at prehistoric burial that we really hadn't considered before. And I leave it there. Thank you very much.